Smile, Vespera, and keep your eyes on your work. The Duke is not come to look at you." The words were pitched low, meant to sting and not to carry, and Norbert, Duke of Linshaw, heard every syllable of them from where he stood beneath the arch of the Westbourne drawing-room door. He had been announced but not yet seen. The family had risen and arranged itself in a hurry, and in that hurry the aunt had leaned toward the plainer of the two young women, and pressed the barb between her teeth like a woman threading a needle. The girl so addressed did not flinch. She only set down the small pair of scissors she had been using to trim a spray of dead leaves from the rosemary in the window, folded her hands, and looked toward the door with a composure that struck him as more remarkable than any curtsy in the room. He had come 300 miles to be looked at, and he found that he could not abide being looked at. That was the whole trouble of him, laid bare in a single breath. 6 years a widower, and the looking had never stopped. The appraising glances of mothers, the calculations of fathers, the practiced radiance of daughters who had learned that a duke was a fortune wearing boots. He had grown a shell against it the way an oyster grows one, out of an old injury that would not heal, and the shell had earned him his reputation. Cold, they called him, proud. The Duke who buried a wife and a good deal of himself with her, and who now went about the country like a man inspecting property he did not intend to purchase. "Your Grace," Sir Harold Westbourne came forward with both hands out, a florid, hopeful man in a coat a season out of fashion. "You honour this house beyond its deserving entirely. May I present my daughter, my eldest, Miss Adela Westbourne?" And there she was, the reason for the 300 miles. Adela Westbourne rose out of the knot of skirts and lamplight like a figure stepped from a painting, and Norbert understood at once why her name had travelled as far as his own dinner tables. She was beautiful in the frank, undeniable way that stops conversation. Dark curls, a complexion like the inside of a shell, a mouth made for the small triumphant smiles she was already beginning to deploy. She sank into a curtsy so perfectly weighted that he could almost hear the hours of its rehearsal, and when she rose her eyes came up to his with exactly the degree of modest daring that the manuals prescribed. "Your Grace does us too much honour," she said, and her voice was low and sweet and entirely aware of itself. "Miss Westbourne." He bowed. He had done this 100 times. The words came without his consent and meant nothing. Behind her the aunt, a narrow woman in violet whom he would shortly learn to call Mrs. Prudence Thackeray, sister to the late Lady Westbourne and mistress of this household in all but name, beamed as though she had personally arranged the sunrise. "And this," Sir Harold went on, with a change in his voice so slight that only a man trained to listen would have caught it, a small deflation, an apology folded into a name, "is my younger daughter, Vespera." The girl from the window came forward. She did not float. She walked, which after Adela's performance was itself a kind of honesty. Her gown was 3 years old at least, a grey that had once been blue, made over at the sleeves with a thrift that did not trouble to hide itself. She was slighter than her sister and quieter in every line, her hair the plain brown of a wren's wing, drawn back without ornament. She curtsied correctly, unshowily, and when she rose she did the one thing no one else in that room had done. She looked at him as though he were a man and not a title. There was no calculation in it and no fear either, only a level, unhurried attention, as if she were reading a page and meant to reach the bottom of it before she formed an opinion. "Your Grace," she said, "nothing more." She did not tell him he honoured the house. "Miss Vespera." He inclined his head, and for a moment, one moment, gone before he could name it, he forgot to be cold. "Vespera keeps our accounts and our garden," Mrs. Thackeray said brightly, in the tone of a woman explaining why a servant had been permitted in the parlour. "She is a great comfort to us in the practical way. Adela, my dove, will you not play for his Grace?" "She has been at the pianoforte since Tuesday last, learning the new airs from town expressly." "I should be glad to hear it," Norbert said, because there was nothing else to say, and because the machinery of the visit had closed around him and there was no honest way out of it until morning. Adela went to the instrument. She played well, better than well. She had been given every advantage that money and ambition could purchase, and she wore them lightly. The room composed itself to admire her. Sir Harold's face shone. Mrs. Thackeray arranged her own features into an expression of tender pride, and did not once take her eyes off the Duke, gauging the effect of her niece as a gunner gauges the fall of shot. Norbert sat where he was placed and watched the beautiful sister's hands move over the keys and felt precisely nothing, which was the sensation he had come to expect of himself and had ceased, long ago, to mourn. It was during the second air that he found his gaze had wandered. Vespera had returned to the window. She had not been invited to sit among the company. No one had thought to invite her, and she had not thought to insist, and so she stood a little apart, half in the lamplight and half out of it. She was listening to her sister play with an expression that undid something in his chest before he had marshaled a defense against it. It was not envy. He had seen envy on 100 faces and knew its pinched geography. This was pleasure, plain, unguarded pleasure in the music given freely to a sister who he was fairly certain had just been unkind to her within the hour. She turned a dead leaf between her fingers as she listened, and her lips moved very slightly with the melody, and she had no notion that anyone was watching her at all. He looked away. It was not what he had come for. When the playing ended, he applauded with the rest, and Sir Harold pressed brandy on him, and the conversation turned, as such conversations must, to the weather and the roads and the health of persons Norbert had never met. He answered as required. But his attention, that disobedient hound, kept slipping its leash and going back to the window, and each time he called it to heel it came a little more reluctantly. "You will find Adela accomplished in every particular," Mrs. Thackeray told him, having contrived to seat herself at his elbow. She had the low, confiding voice of a woman selling something she believes to be underpriced. Her drawing is admired throughout the county. Her needlework was praised by the Countess of Marden herself, and she has a sweetness of temper, your grace, that no accomplishment can teach. A duchess, she added, with a small significant pressure on the word, is not made only of what a governess can supply. No, Norbert agreed. I do not believe she is. Vespera, of course, is a different sort of creature. The aunt's voice cooled by exactly the degree that decency permitted. We are fond of her. One is fond of what is useful. But she has not had Adela's advantages, nor Adela's. She paused, delicately, choosing the cruelty as a woman chooses a ribbon. Her prospects. There was a one of fortune, you understand, on the mother's side, and the girl favours it. We do what we can for her. It is a Christian duty. Across the room, Vespera was gathering the cups on a tray that a servant ought to have carried, and Norbert saw that she had heard. She must have heard. The room was not large. She did not colour, and she did not hurry, and she did not look toward her aunt for permission or reproach. She simply finished her task with the same unhurried care she had given the rosemary, and something in the straightness of her back told him she had heard such things many hundreds of times, and had long since decided that they would not be permitted to bend her. He had known men in his regiment who could not manage half so much under half so light a fire. "You are generous," he said to Mrs. Thackeray, and he was aware distantly that his voice had gone flat in a way that people who knew him had learned to fear. The aunt, who did not know him, took it for approval. Supper was announced, and there was a small ugliness in the ordering of it that he was not meant to see. He saw it, Mrs. Thackeray moving among her charges like a general dressing a line. Murmured something to Vespera that sent the younger girl not to the table but out of the room entirely. To see to some matter in the kitchen, he gathered a burnt sauce or a sulking cook, so that the Duke should not have the plainer daughter set before him as a distraction. Adela was placed at his right hand. Vespera was placed nowhere. She went without argument, pausing only to touch her sister's shoulder in passing, a small, real gesture, entirely without audience, meant for no one's benefit but the doing of it, and then she was gone. And the door closed behind her, and Norbert found that the room had grown, somehow, a great deal less interesting. He performed his duty at supper. Adela was charming. He could not fault her charm, only its evident manufacture. She laughed at the correct moments and lowered her lashes at the correct moments and told him, twice, how dull the country was and how she longed for society, and each time she said it he thought of her sister listening to music at a window with a dead leaf in her fingers, wanting nothing, performing for no one. He drank his wine and said what a duke is expected to say, and beneath the table his hand had closed slowly into a fist without his knowing it. Once, when a footman's clumsiness sent a dish of stewed pears sliding toward the cloth's edge. It was neither Sir Harold nor the aunt who caught it, for Vespera had come back into the room a moment, unbidden, bearing a fresh decanter no one had asked her for, and her hand shot out and steadied the dish before a drop was spilled, quick and sure and entirely unthanked. Mrs. Thackeray's glance flicked to her, sharp as a pin, and the younger sister set down the decanter and withdrew again without a word, and Norbert understood that this was the shape of every day in that house. The beauty adorned it, and the plain one held it up. And the household had arranged itself never to notice the difference. He noticed. He found he could not stop noticing. He turned his glass by its stem and made some answer to Adela about the roads, and did not hear his own voice for the roaring of a thought he had no business thinking. "You are very silent, Your Grace," Adela said with a pretty tilt of her head. "I hope the country has not bored you already. I should be so mortified." "On the contrary," he said, "I find I have been given a great deal to consider." The answer pleased her. She took it for gallantry and dimpled, and her aunt across the board took it for progress and glowed. Neither of them had any notion that the thing he was considering had just walked out of the room with a decanter in her hands. It was late, the candles low, Sir Harold gone red and expansive, Mrs. Thackeray watching the whole board with the tireless vigilance of a woman who has staked a great deal on a single throw, when Norbert learned the shape of the thing he had walked into. Sir Harold, warmed past discretion, let it fall. The estate was mortgaged. The season in town, the gowns, the pianoforte master engaged expressly, the whole gorgeous machinery of Adela's presentation, all of it was borrowed against a hope, and the hope was the Duke of Linshall. A brilliant match would carry the family clear. A failure would sink it. There was a creditor, a Mr. Coving of the city, who held the paper and had lately begun to press, and Mrs. Thackeray, it emerged, had already half promised the man that his patience would be handsomely rewarded before Michaelmas, for by Michaelmas she was confident there would be a duchess in the family and no more talk of debts at all. "Prudence, my dear," Sir Harold said, too loudly, "you run ahead of us." "His Grace has scarce set down his fork. His Grace understands the ways of the world," said Mrs. Thackeray, smiling at Norbert with her narrow violet eyes, "better than any man in it, I dare say. He knows that a family is a thing to be secured." And Adela, she laid her hand upon the beautiful girl's arm as one lays a hand upon a title deed, "is the securing of ours." So that was it, then. He had come to be a purchase, and he had known that much before he set out. There was nothing novel in a family that wished to sell a daughter to a dukedom. What was new, what he turned over and over as the carriage of his mind rolled on through the small talk, was the daughter they had hidden away in the kitchen to keep the transaction clean. They had two, and they meant him to buy the one that had been polished for market, and they had bundled the other out of sight lest she distract the buyer, and she had. God help him, in the space of a single evening and without a syllable of effort, she had. He rose to take his leave earlier than courtesy strictly required, and the family flowed into the hall around him in a bright, anxious tide, Sir Harold pressing the honour of the visit, Mrs. Thackeray already speaking of the assembly on Thursday next and how his Grace must, positively must, attend and stand up with Adela before the whole county. He gave the answers that kept the door open. He was not yet certain why he wished it kept open. He told himself it was the debt, the ugliness of it, the wish to see how so nakedly transactional a business would play itself out. He was a man long practiced in lying to himself, and he did it now with real skill. At the door, drawing on his gloves, he glanced once, only once, down the dim passage that led toward the back of the house and saw her. Vespera had come out from the kitchen to see the candles doused, a lamp in her hand, and she had stopped when she saw him, the two of them a room's length and a whole social world apart. She did not curtsy again. The moment did not seem to call for it. She only looked at him steadily in the small pool of her own light, and inclined her head the smallest degree, not the bob of a servant nor the flourish of a hopeful girl, but the simple acknowledgment of one person to another across a distance neither had chosen. "Good night," the gesture said, and nothing more, and asked nothing in return. He inclined his head back. It was the most honest exchange he had had beneath that roof. Then Mrs. Thackeray's voice was at his shoulders, sweet as syrup and hard as slate. "Do not mind Vespera, Your Grace. She forgets herself, poor thing, and a shadow of annoyance crossed the aunt's face as she saw where the Duke's eyes had gone, and Norbert watched her file the observation away behind her smile like a woman noting an unpaid account. He understood in that instant that he had made the quiet sister a liability merely by looking at her, and that the woman in violet was not one to leave a liability standing. "Thursday, then," he said, to none of them and all of them, and went out into the cold where the horses waited and his own breath smoked in the dark. The carriage took him down the drive and out between the black hedges, and he did not, as was his custom, close his eyes and count the miles until sleep. He sat with his gloved hands loose upon his knee and looked at nothing, and against the nothing he kept seeing a grey made-over gown and a straight back under a light unkindness, and a woman who had trimmed a dead leaf from the rosemary, while her whole family sold her sister a room away. He had come to court a beauty and secure a bargain and go home unmoved, as he always went home unmoved. Somewhere on the 300 miles between his own gates and this one he had made himself a promise that he would feel nothing, and he had kept that promise for 6 long years the way a sentry keeps a wall. The wall had a crack in it now. He could feel the cold coming through. And the worst of it, the thing that kept his eyes open all the long dark way to the inn, was that he was not at all certain he wished to mend it. The Duke of Linshore did not sleep in strange houses. He had learned long ago that a man in his position was never truly a guest anywhere. He was a prize being weighed, a fortune being measured against the depth of someone's ambition, and he had no wish to lie abed pretending otherwise. So it was that Norbert rose before the household stirred, dressed himself without waking the valet who snored in the adjoining room, and let himself out through a side door of Merrodon Hall into the grey hush of the morning. The gardens were wet with dew and smelled of turned earth and late roses. He walked without direction, glad of the cold on his face, glad to be for 1 hour a man rather than a title. The previous evening still sat ill with him. He had come to Merrodon at the urging of half the county, come to look upon the celebrated Miss Prudence Thackeray, whose beauty was spoken of in 3 shires as though it were a natural wonder to be visited and admired, and she had been beautiful. He would grant her that much. She had descended the great staircase in candlelight with the practiced slowness of a woman who knew precisely how long a room would hold its breath for her, and she had smiled at him, and every syllable she spoke had been arranged beforehand like flowers in a bowl. He had seen it all before. That was the trouble. 15 years ago another beautiful woman had smiled at him just so, had called his estate charming and his conversation without equal, and had wept prettily over her devotion until the settlement was signed and she had what she wanted, which had never once been him. He had been young then, and had believed her, and the believing had cost him more than money. It had cost him the easy trust a man is only given once. Since that season the Duke of Linshore had worn his reserve like armour, and the county called him proud and cold, and he let them, because a cold man is at least protected from being made a fool of twice. So he had watched Prudence Thackeray perform, and had said the correct things, and had gone up to his borrowed room, resolving to stay the fortnight out of courtesy, and then to go home to Linshore and its silence, which he preferred to any of this. He came round a tall yew hedge and stopped. A young woman knelt at the border with her sleeves pushed to the elbow and her hands in the dirt. She had a flat wicker basket beside her, half filled with cuttings, and a smudge of soil along her jaw where she had pushed back a loosened strand of hair. She was not dressed for company. Her gown was of plain grey stuff, serviceable and much washed, and there was nothing about her arranged for any eye at all. She was humming something low and unmusical to herself, entirely absorbed, and she did not hear him. Norbert ought to have withdrawn. A gentleman did not observe a woman unaware, but he found he did not move, and after a moment she sat back on her heels, wiped her wrist across her brow and saw him. She did not startle theatrically. She did not spring up with a little cry and press a hand to her bosom. She looked at him with a frank, steady surprise, took swift stock of the fine coat and the boots that had never known a garden, and said in a voice that was low and unhurried, "You are up very early for a guest." "I might say the same of a lady," he answered. "I am no lady this hour of the morning. I am the one who sees the roses are cut back before the frost, or they will be ruined by Michaelmas, and everyone will wonder how it happened." She rose then unhurried, brushing the earth from her palms against her apron. She was younger than he had first thought, and plainer than her sister by every measure the county used, and yet there was something in the set of her shoulders that would not be overlooked once it had been seen. "You will be the Duke," she said. It was not a curtsy, and it was not flattery. It was a fact, offered plainly. "We are all in a great commotion over you. You must forgive the house. It has not been so scoured and polished since the king's health was drunk here, and that was before I could walk." He had spent 15 years being addressed with careful reverence, and he did not know what to do with a woman who spoke to him as though he were merely a person who happened to have come out to see the garden. "You have the advantage of me," he said. Vespera Westbourne. She said her own name the way she had said the rose beds, without ornament. Prudence's sister, her half-sister more truly, though the distinction is only ever raised when someone wishes to remind me of it. A small, dry humour touched the corner of her mouth and was gone. "You need not look for the likeness. There isn't one. She had all the beauty and I had the early rising, and on the whole I think I have the better of the bargain, for beauty must be maintained and rising is a habit." Norbert was aware, with some discomfort, that he had not smiled in company since before he came into the county, and that he was very near to smiling now. He mastered it. "You keep the gardens yourself?" "I keep a great many things myself." She bent, lifted the wicker basket to her hip, and there was no pity in it, only the plain economy of a person accustomed to being useful. "It is cheaper than keeping a man to do it, and Merowden must be careful now. But I would not have you think it a hardship, your grace. I like the roses. They do not care in the least who my father was, nor how large my portion is, and there are precious few things at Merowden this month of which the same may be said." It was as near to a rebuke of her own family as good breeding would allow, and yet it was not bitter. She stated it and let it lie, and then she looked at him with those steady grey eyes as if to see whether he would be shocked or bored or would pretend not to have understood. He was none of those things. He was, though he would not have confessed it under torture, arrested. Here in the wet grey light, with dirt on her sleeve and a basket on her hip, this overlooked younger sister had told him more true things in the space of 3 minutes than the whole glittering household had managed in an evening of effort. "You are very frank," he said. "Would you rather I were not?" She tilted her head, considering him with an interest that was plainly real and plainly without any design upon him whatever. "Everyone else in this house will be frank with you about nothing at all for the next fortnight, your grace. They will tell you the beef is admirable and the weather set fair, and that you are the cleverest man in 3 counties, and not one word of it will be to be trusted, because every word will be spent in the hope of a wedding. I have nothing to gain from you, so you may believe what little I say. I should think a man in your position would find that a rarity worth an early rising." She had struck, without the smallest notion of it, upon the exact wound of his whole life, the certainty that no gentle word came to a duke unpurchased, that behind every smile was a settlement being drawn, and she had struck it lightly in passing, as one remarks upon the frost. Norbert felt the old bruise ache and, unaccountably, felt something ease against it too, as a cold thing eases toward a fire before the mind has given it leave. "And what," he asked, before he had decided to, "have you to say of your sister that a man might trust?" Vespera did not seize the opening as another woman would have done, to slander a rival and advance herself. She only looked at him a moment, and something careful came into her face. "That she is very beautiful," she said, "and that beauty was the only coin our mother ever taught her she possessed, and a girl cannot well be blamed for spending the only coin she was given. Judge her gently, your grace, whatever you decide. She was made what she is. We are none of us quite the authors of ourselves." She turned toward a gap in the hedge. "But you have caught me before I had my manners on, your grace, and it seemed a waste of a fine morning to go and fetch them. Prudence will have manners enough for the both of us at breakfast, and to spare. You had far better save your admiration for her. It is what you came for, after all." And she inclined her head, not a servant's bob nor a coquette's dip, but something graver and more her own, and went away through the hedge with the basket, humming again before she was 10 steps gone, as though a duke in her garden were a matter of no great consequence, and the roses very much were. Norbert stood where she had left him for longer than he could afterward account for. Breakfast at Merowden was a different country. The morning room had been thrown open to the sun, the table laid with more silver than the family could comfortably possess, and Miss Prudence Thackeray sat at the head of it in a gown of primrose muslin that had certainly not been chosen for a mere family meal. She was, again, beautiful. He noted it as one notes the weather, and she was again performing, and now that he had spent 3 minutes in the garden he found he could see the performance as plainly as if it had been written out on a card and handed to him. "Your Grace slept well, I hope," she said, and every word was a small bright coin laid before him. "I confess I lay awake half the night for fear the house was not fine enough to keep a man used to Linshore. They say is the most beautiful seat in the north. I have always thought I should die of happiness merely to see it. It is a house," Norbert said, "stone and glass, like others." Prudence laughed as though he had been very witty, a sound like a little run of bells, and pressed on undiscouraged, for such women are never discouraged by a plain answer. They simply lay another coin. He answered her civilly and ate very little and found that his attention, against every command he gave it, kept drifting to the foot of the table. Vespera had come in scrubbed and changed into a second grey gown no finer than the first, and she had been given the place at the very end, past the empty chairs, where a person is set when the family wishes to say without saying it that she is present on sufferance. She did not seem to mind it. She poured her own chocolate, saw that the elderly aunt beside her had her bread cut small, and spoke only when spoken to, which was seldom. "Vespera," said Prudence at length, without turning her head, in the sweet carrying voice of a woman displaying her own generosity for a duke's benefit, "do send up for more of the good preserve. His Grace will not want the ordinary sort." A pause, delicate as a dropped handkerchief. "My sister is so very handy about the house. We should be quite lost without her. She has such a gift for the small useful things. Has she not, mamma? Some are born to be admired, and some to be depended upon, and it is a mercy the good Lord sorts us out so tiddily." It was cruelty, but polished to such a high shine that a stranger might have taken it for praise. The mother murmured her agreement. A cousin down the table tittered. And Norbert, who had endured 15 years of drawing rooms and knew precisely the sound a room makes when it has agreed together to make one person small, felt something in his chest go very still and cold. He looked to the foot of the table to see the wound land. Vespera had set down her cup. She did not colour, nor drop her eyes, nor summon the brittle smile of the humiliated who must pretend not to be. She met her sister's gaze down the length of the silver, and there was in her face only a great, calm, unhurried steadiness, the same he had seen among the roses. "It is quite true," she said, and her voice carried no farther than it needed to, which somehow made the whole table lean toward it. "I am depended upon. It is not the worst thing a woman can be. A thing that is depended upon is generally still standing when the thing that is only admired has been set upon a shelf and forgotten." She reached, unhurried, and refilled the old aunt's cup before her own. "But you shall have your preserve, Prudence. I made myself in August. I am glad it is thought good enough for a duke." Silence held the room for the length of a breath. Prudence's smile did not slip. She was far too practiced for that. But something moved behind her lovely eyes, a flicker of a woman who has swung at what she took for a still target and found it had quietly stepped aside. The cousin's titter died, and Norbert, at the head of the table, discovered that he had set down his own cup and was looking openly down the length of Merodin's best silver at a woman in a grey gown, and that he had entirely forgotten the beauty seated at his very elbow, who had been arranged there at such cost expressly so that he might look at nothing else. "Miss Westbourne," he said, and his voice fell into the quiet with more weight than he had intended, so that every head at the table turned. "I have kept a great table for a great many years, and I have been served preserves from Paris and from the king's own hothouses. I do not recall one of them being made by the hand of the lady who then offered it to me. I should be glad of yours. I think it will be better than any of them." He had not planned to say it. It went past his guard the way her frankness had gone past it in the garden, before the sentries were at their posts. He saw the small astonishment move round the table, saw Prudence's chin lift a fraction, saw the mother's brow contract, saw the cousin glance from the great duke to the overlooked sister and back, as though the furniture had begun to rearrange itself. And he saw, at the foot of the table, that Vespera's calm was for one instant genuinely shaken. A faint colour came into her cheek at last, not for the insult but for the kindness, which she had plainly not looked to receive from any quarter, least of all from him. She recovered at once. "You are gracious, your grace," she said quietly, and there was a worriness in it now, a woman who had learned not to trust sudden warmth, for warmth at Merodan generally came with a price attached. "I hope it does not disappoint you. I do not think it will," he said. Prudence rallied then, of course, and turned the conversation with a bright observation upon the hunting to be had in the north, and the mother seized upon it gratefully, and the table closed over the moment like water over a dropped stone. But the stone had gone down, and Norbert felt it lying at the bottom of him for the rest of that long and glittering meal. He answered Prudence when she spoke to him. He was civil. He was even, he supposed, everything a suitor ought to be. But his eyes betrayed him a dozen times before the covers were drawn, sliding down that length of table to where the quiet sister sat cutting bread small for an old woman, seeing that others were fed before she troubled about herself, once. So low that surely no one but he could have heard it. Each time he called his attention back to its duty. Each time it slipped its collar again within the minute. This was precisely the danger he had crossed 15 years arranging his whole life to avoid. He knew it. He told himself so, sternly, over the cooling chocolate. He had come to Merodan with his eyes open, to court a beautiful woman for suitable and sensible reasons, and to feel exactly nothing, which was the only safe way for the Duke of Linshore to conduct such an affair. He had not come to be undone at a breakfast table by a woman with dirt still likely under her nails, who had told him plainly to save his admiration for her sister, and had then made herself the space of one honest sentence, entirely and ruinously impossible to look away from. When at last the party rose and Prudence contrived to take his arm toward the long gallery, chattering of the portraits and the view, Norbert went with her because there was nothing else a civil man could do. But at the door he glanced back once, unable to help himself, to the emptying room. Vespera was gathering the old aunt's shawl about her thin shoulders, her grey head bent, her whole attention given without stint to a person from whom she could gain nothing at all. She did not look up. She did not know he watched. And that, he understood with a slow and unwelcome certainty, was the whole of it, that she performed for no one, wanted nothing of him, and would go on being exactly herself whether a duke was in the room or 100 miles away. 15 years of armour, and he had walked out one grey morning to see the roses, and had come back in without it, and did not yet know how he was to get it on again. The assembly rooms at Hardwicke were the finest the county could boast, and on Thursday night they were lit as though for a coronation. Norbert had attended 100 such gatherings and disliked every one, the heat of them, the masked candles, the perfumed press of people who wished to be seen speaking to him and had nothing to say. He stood now near the top of the long room with a glass he did not drink from, and let the county come to him in its ordered ranks, the squires and their wives, the militia captains, the vicar with his 3 marriageable daughters. And he answered each with the exact measure of civility his rank required, and no more. His reputation went before him and cleared a small cold space in which he might stand alone. He had cultivated that space for years. Tonight, for the first time he could remember, he found it did not content him, for the one face he looked for was not in the room. He had told himself in the carriage that he did not look for it. He told himself so again now, and did not believe it, which was a new and unwelcome accomplishment in a man who had lied to himself with such ease for 6 years. The Westbournes came late, and they came in state. Mrs. Thackeray entered first, in a fresh gown of deep plum that must have cost more than the family could well afford, and behind her Sir Harold, and between them Adela in white and silver, her dark curls dressed with a spray of hothouse jasmine, so frankly and completely beautiful that a rustle went along the room like wind through standing corn. Heads turned, fans paused. Mrs. Thackeray received the tribute of that rustle as her personal due, and steered her niece up the length of the floor toward the Duke with the unhurried confidence of a woman leading a prize mare to the ring, and a pace behind them all, where the light thinned toward doorway, came Vespera. She had not been dressed for conquest. That was plain in a glance, and plainer still when set beside her sister's silver. Her gown was the grey again, the same made-over grey, though he saw she had done something to it. A fresh ribbon at the waist, a bit of lace at the throat that had been laundered until it was almost white. Small honest labours meant to make an old thing decent rather than fine. She carried her sister's shawl and her aunt's second fan in a little reticule that was not her own, and she carried them without resentment, as a person carries what is handed to her. She was there, he understood, not as a guest but as an appendage. A pair of useful hands got up in grey to hold the beauty's things while the beauty was admired. No one in that glittering room looked at her twice. He looked, could not stop, and hated himself a little for the ease with which his eyes found her across so much light. Your Grace. Mrs. Thackeray had arrived, and Adela with her, and the curtsy the beautiful sister sank into was a small masterpiece that drew glances from 10 feet off. You are goodness itself to come. Adela has spoke of nothing else this se'night. Have you not, my dove? My aunt exaggerates, said Adela, with a modesty so practised it had the gloss of the genuine, and she raised her lovely eyes to his exactly as far as the manuals allowed. Miss Westbourne. He bowed. He was aware, even as he did it, that he had angled himself the merest degree to keep the grey gown in the tail of his sight, and that Mrs. Thackeray, who missed nothing that touched her design, had marked the angle. Her smile did not falter, but her eyes went once, sharp and brief, to her younger niece, and Norbert saw the calculation move behind them like a fish under ice. The music struck up for the first set. He asked Adela to stand up with him, because there was no possible way to avoid it, and because half the county had come expressly to see him do it. And he led her out, and they danced, and she danced as she did everything, with a flawless and joyless correctness that he found. He could admire the way one admires a well-made clock. She talked as they moved down the line of town, of the tedium of the country, of a lady someone's ball she had heard described and longed to attend, and he made the answers that cost him nothing, and over the white curve of her shoulder, each time the figure turned him toward the wall. He saw Vespera standing among the chaperones and the wallflowers with her arms full of other women's belongings, watching the dancers with that same unenvious pleasure he had seen at the window, wanting nothing, asking nothing, invisible to everyone but him. The set ended. He returned Adela to her aunt with a bow, and the machinery of the evening might have carried him on to the card-room and the tedious duty of losing a little money to the local gentry, but for what came next, which he had not looked for and would not soon forget. It began as such things do in play. A knot of young people had gathered near the windows, Adela at the heart of it, and among them a Miss Coving, daughter, he gathered, of the very creditor who held the Westbourne paper, a hard, bright girl who had attached herself to Adela's train as the surest way to shine by borrowed light. There was laughter, and then there was a particular quality to the laughter, the low, collusive kind that is aimed rather than shared, and Norbert, passing near on his way nowhere in particular, slowed. For it is the same gown, I am certain of it, only turned, Miss Coving was saying in a voice pitched to travel just far enough. One admires such economy. My maid does wonders with an old thing too, when it is past being worn above a stairs. A ripple of laughter. Tell me, Miss Vespera, is it very tiresome being always the useful one? I should die of it. To fetch and carry at one's own sister's triumph? No, I could not bear to be so obliging. Vespera had been summoned into the circle for precisely this, he saw, drawn in under the cover of friendliness so that the cruelty might be done to her face and enjoyed. Mrs. Thackeray stood a little apart with two matrons, and she did not intervene, and the small, pleased stillness of her told him she had known this was coming, and had perhaps, in some earlier and subtler conversation, helped it on its way. Here was the household's arithmetic performed in public, the plain one held up to the light, so that the beautiful one might glitter the brighter by contrast. Adela, to her small credit, had the grace to look faintly uncomfortable, but she did not speak, and her silence was its own kind of answer. It is not tiresome at all, said Vespera. She said it quietly, without heat, and the very evenness of it made the circle lean in to hear. She did not clutch the shawl tighter or drop her eyes or summon the trembling smile that would have delighted them. She looked at Miss Coving with that level, unhurried attention Norbert had marked from the first, as though she were reading the girl to the bottom of the page. I have found, Vespera went on, that there is a great deal to be learned about people from watching who they thank and who they do not. It is quite the most instructive occupation in any room. I would not give it up for all the dancing in the world. A small pause mild as milk. You need not pity me, Miss Coving. I am the only person here at leisure to see everyone plainly. I assure you it is a privilege. For a moment no one laughed, because no one was entirely certain they had not just been told something about themselves. Miss Coving's smile stiffened at the corners. The barb had been turned in the girl's own hand and handed back to her hilt first, so gently that she could not object to it without confessing what she had meant. It was, Norbert thought, the neatest piece of work he had witnessed all season, a single quiet reply that drew no blood and yet the whole circle disarmed and faintly ashamed, and the woman who had made it stood there in her turned grey gown as composed as if she had remarked upon the weather. And then, because the silence wanted breaking and someone would break it cruelly if he did not, Norbert did a thing he had not planned and could not afterward wholly explain. He stepped forward into the circle, and the circle came apart before him like curds, and he inclined his head to the woman in grey with the same gravity he would have shown a duchess. "Miss Vespera," he said, "the next is forming. Will you do me the honour?" He heard distinctly the small collective intake of breath. He was aware of Mrs. Thackeray's turning across the room as though jerked by a wire, of Adela's lovely face gone blank with an astonishment she was too well trained to voice, of Miss Coving's mouth opening and closing on nothing. To ask the plain, portionless, unregarded younger sister to stand up, the Duke of Linshaw, who had come 300 miles to court the beauty, who had danced the first set with her not an hour since. It was very nearly an outrage, a small public overturning of the natural order of that room. And he had done it without weighing the cost, moved by something he had thought long dead in him, and now felt beating quite distinctly against his ribs. Vespera looked at him. She did not blush, or simper, or fling a triumphant glance at her tormentors. She looked at him for a heartbeat with something in her face that might have been surprise and might have been a question. Not is this real, but why? And Norbert found he could not have answered it if she had asked aloud. "I am holding my sister's shawl," she said. "Then we shall find someone to hold it who is better suited to the office," he answered, and he turned unhurried and held out his hand not to a servant, but to Miss Coving, whose own barb about maids and cast-off gowns still hung in the air. "Miss Coving, I am sure, will oblige." She was but this moment speaking of her fondness for being useful. There was a strangled little silence, and then Miss Coving, who could no more refuse a duke than fly, took the shawl into her arms with a face like curdled cream, and the laughter that went round the circle now was of a wholly different kind, and it was not aimed at Vespera. Norbert did not smile. He merely stood with his hand extended and waited, and after a moment seemed to him very long. Vespera laid her fingers lightly upon his, and he led her out onto the floor while half the county pretended not to stare. She danced well, not brilliantly as her sis did, but truly, in time and without effort, the way a person moves who has been happy in her body before she was taught to be watchful of it. She did not chatter. She did not fill the figures with the practised nothings he had endured all evening. When the pattern brought them together she met his eyes, and when it drew them apart she let them part, and the silence between them was not the awkward silence of two strangers, but the companionable quiet of two people who had privately agreed that speech was not owed. "You need not have done that," she said at last low as the dance turned them down the line. "It will cost you more than you know." "I am tolerably well acquainted with what things cost," he said. "Not this one, I think." She said it without reproach. "You have made me interesting, your grace, which is the one thing I have taken great pains never to be. My aunt will forgive me a good deal, but she will not forgive me that." He looked at her sharply, for it was the truth, and no one in that house had spoken him the truth all week. "Then let her hold me to account for it," he said. "It was my doing and not yours." "It does not work in that direction," Vespera said, "as you very well know." And she smiled, the first he had seen from her, small and rueful and quickly gone. And it was not aimed to charm him and did not calculate its effect, and it undid him rather more thoroughly than an hour of Adela's dimpling had failed to do. The set ended too soon. He did not return her to the circle by the windows, where Miss Coving stood clutching the borrowed shawl in mutinous silence. Instead he drew her, by the plain expedient of not letting go of her hand a moment longer than the music strictly allowed, toward the cooler air near the tall doors that stood open to the terrace, where a few couples took the night breeze and conversation could be had a little apart from the crush. "You are wondering," she said, before he could frame the thing he wished to ask, "why a woman got up to carry shawls should speak to a duke as though she had the right." She turned the reticule that was not hers in her hands. "It is only that I have nothing to lose by it, your grace. That is not a boast. A person who is already at the bottom of the account has a great freedom the rest of you are denied. She may say what she sees. My sister must weigh every word against her prospects. My aunt must weigh every word against her hopes. I have no prospects and I am not permitted hopes, and so I find I have only the plain truth to spend, and I have grown rather careful in how I spend it." "And what do you see," he said, "when you look at me?" She was quiet a moment. On the far side of the room the music had begun again, and the candlelight lay along the line of her cheek, and he waited for the answer he had heard from 100 mouths, that he was gracious, that he was too kind, that the house was honored. He found, with a small shock, that he did not want to hear it from her, that he would rather she said nothing at all than said that. "I see a man who has decided that feeling nothing is the same as being safe," Vespera said, "and who is beginning to suspect he was wrong, and does not at all care for the discovery." She met his eyes without apology. "You asked. I did warn you I was careless with the truth." It landed in him like a stone dropped down a deep well, the long fall, and then the small far sound of water, and then the knowledge of how deep the well went. No one had said such a thing to him in 6 years. No one had dared, and no one had troubled to look closely enough to be able to. She had done both, this portionless girl in a turned grey gown whom her own family had dressed as a servant and sent among the wolves to make her sister glitter, and she had done it without cruelty and without design, wanting nothing from him, expecting nothing, offering him only the unbearable gift of being seen. "You are not what I came for," he said. It was not quite what he meant. It was as near as he could come. "No," she agreed gently, "I know it. You came for Adela, and Adela is everything they say she is, and you would do a great many people a great deal of good by marrying her." She said it without a trace of self-pity, plainly as a woman states a sum she has checked twice. "You need not trouble on my account, your grace. I am quite accustomed to my own company. I would not have you mistake an hour's kindness for a debt." And there it was, the door held open for him, the easy exit, the gracious release from whatever this was that he had not meant to begin. She had handed it to him the way she handed her Aunt a fan. Any sensible man would have taken it. Any man who had kept a wall 6 years and meant to keep it would have bowed and thanked her, and gone to find Sir Harold and speak of Adela and settlements and the securing of a family, and let the grey gown vanish back into the crowd where the world had agreed it belonged. He heard himself say, "And if I do not wish to be released?" Vespera went still. For the first time all evening the composure wavered, not into fear and not into hope exactly, but into something more naked than either, a startled uncertainty, as though he had spoken in a language she had long ago stopped expecting to hear. The reticule went quiet in her hands. "Then you would be very foolish," she said at last, softly, "and I would not have thought you a foolish man. I am discovering," Norbert said, "that I know a great deal less about myself than I supposed a week ago." He was very near her now, nearer than the terrace doors made proper, and the noise of the assembly had drawn back to a great distance, and he was conscious of nothing in the whole bright roaring room but the small grey figure before him and the wholly unfamiliar difficulty he was having in wishing to be anywhere else. "Tell me something, Miss Vespera, and tell me truly, since you deal in nothing else. Do you wish me to go?" She looked up at him, and for a long moment she did not answer, and in that moment he understood that whatever careful bottom of the account she had made her peace with had just shifted beneath her feet, and that she was as frightened of this as he was, and rather braver about it. "No," she said. "God help me, no. But I think you ought to, all the same." And down the length of the crowded room, past the dancers and the card tables and the massed indifferent candles, Norbert saw Mrs. Thackeray watching them across it all, her plum gown very still, her face composed into its company smile and her narrow eyes doing sums, and he knew, with the cold clarity of a man who has just discovered how much he stands to lose, that the woman in violet had seen everything and would not let it stand. He stayed the fortnight, as courtesy required, and told himself each morning it was courtesy that kept him. It was a poor lie, and he knew it for one. A man does not walk the length of a wet garden 3 days running in the hour before breakfast for the sake of courtesy, nor find himself unaccountably at leisure near the still room and the kitchen court, where the mistress of the house would never think to look for a duke, and where a woman in a grey gown was forever passing with her sleeves turned back and her arms full of the ordinary business of the place. He saw a great deal of Prudence Thackeray in those days, for she saw to it that he should. She walked with him in the gallery and named the ancestors, most of whom were painted better than they had lived. She played for him in the evenings and sang, and turned her lovely head to catch the candlelight as a jeweller turns a stone. She was, he would grant to his dying day, one of the handsomest women in England, and he watched her display herself with the mild, distant admiration a man gives a fine horse he does not intend to buy, and understood more clearly with each performance that there was nothing behind the beauty that had not been put there to be seen. She never once, in a fortnight, said a thing to him she had not first decided would improve her. Her half-sister said nothing to improve herself at all. That was the whole of the difference, and it was undoing him by degrees so small he could not have named the hour it became irreparable. It was on the 5th evening that he found her in the library. He had gone there to escape the drawing-room, where Prudence was tuning the harp and the mother was arranging her daughter's arms upon it to best effect, and where the cousin had begun a story about a viscount that promised to be long. He had pleaded a letter to write. He had not expected the library to be occupied, and he checked at the threshold when he saw the single candle burning at the far table and the grey figure bent beneath it. Vespera looked up without alarm. She had a great ledger open before her, and a pen in her hand, and a smudge of ink upon her middle finger, and she regarded him over the top of it with the same frank steadiness she had shown among the roses. "You have found the one room in the house nobody scores," she said, "because nobody comes here but me. You had better shut the door, your grace, or the cold gets in, and I have only the one candle. We are careful of candles at Merodon." He shut the door. He ought to have made his excuses and gone. A gentleman did not sit alone with an unmarried woman in a shut room by a single candle, and he had spent 15 years being precisely the sort of man who did not. He crossed the room and sat down across the table from her instead, and could no more have accounted for it than for the tide. "You keep the accounts as well as the roses," he said, looking at the ledger. "I keep the accounts because if I did not, no one would. And then one day the men would come and there would be a great astonishment in this house that nobody had foreseen it." She wiped the pen and laid it in the tray. "My father is a hopeful man. Hope is a fine quality in a companion and a ruinous one in a landlord. He believes that the next quarter will be kinder than the last, and he has believed it now for 11 years, and the belief has cost us the East Farms and the London house, and this spring the carriage horses. Though we tell the county they are gone to be rested," a small dry lift at the corner of her mouth, "they are resting in Norfolk, in another man's traces. I do not think they miss us." She said it without a scrap of pity, as another woman might report the weather, and he found that the plainness of it moved him more than any tears could have done. "And so the whole hope of the house is fixed upon a duke," he said quietly, "who came 300 miles to look at your sister. You are not to say it as though it were a wicked thing." She closed the ledger and folded her ink-stained hands upon it. "It is only what families such as ours must do. A pretty daughter is the one crop we can still raise in poor ground, and Prudence was raised for it as carefully as ever a hothouse peach was raised for a table. She cannot help what she was made for any more than you can help being the man who might mend the roof. I do not blame her, and you must not think I do. I only came into the world by a different door, and no one troubled to raise me for anything, and so I raised the roses instead, and learned to keep a ledger, and here we both are." She tilted her head. "Does it distress you, your grace, to be spoken to as a roof and a set of horses? I find great men are seldom told what they are actually wanted for. It seems to me a kindness to be plain about it. Then you know where you stand, and may go home whole." "And your mother?" he asked, for he had gathered from the breakfast table that there was a mother yet living in the house, the one Prudence called Mamma, who had watched her handsome daughter and her plain one across the silver with two very different faces. Was she raised for anything, or only your sister? Something crossed Vespera's face then that was not quite a shadow. Prudence's mother is the lady of this house, she said. My own has been 10 years in the churchyard, and she was my father's first wife, and a gentlewoman with more sense than fortune, which is the least profitable combination a woman can be born to. She taught me my letters and my herbs, and to keep my own counsel, and to be useful without ever letting it be seen how much the being useful cost me, for a poor relation who is seen to labor is pitied, and a poor relation who is seen to complain is turned out. She died before she could teach me how to be anything grander, and I have never had the leisure to learn it since. She smoothed the cover of the ledger with one ink-stained hand, quite calmly. So you see I am not to be pitied, your grace, whatever my sister may have told you. I had a mother who loved me and taught me true things, which is more than many a great lady got from hers, and I have work I am not ashamed of, and a garden that answers when I tend it. It is a narrow life. It is not a mean one. I would not trade the little of it that is truly mine for all the wide borrowed, admired one my sister lives, in which nothing is her own and everything must be maintained. He said nothing for a moment. He was thinking that in 15 years of being courted for his acres, he had never once heard a person in a marriageable house declare that they wanted for nothing, and mean it, and it left him strangely bereft. As a man is bereft who has finally the door he has been seeking and discovers he has no coin to pay the toll of it. You are the second person in this county to counsel me to go home, he said. The first was you also in the garden 3 mornings since. Then perhaps you ought to attend to me, she said, for I have no reason to lie to you, and everyone else in this house has a very great one. He should have laughed it off. Instead he heard himself say, lo, what if a man did not wish to go home? The words were out before the sentries reached their posts, the way it always was with her. He saw them land. He saw her go still, not the practiced stillness of a woman receiving a compliment, but a genuine arrest, as though the ground had shifted a half-inch beneath a person who had built her whole piece on its being firm. The candle flame stood straight between them. Somewhere beyond the door the harp began, faint and flawless, Prudence's music travelling the cold passages to remind them both what he had come for. Then he would be a fool, Vespera said at last, very gently, and there was no unkindness in it, only a warning offered as one offers a hand to a man near an edge in the dark. A great man who did not wish to go home would make a great deal of trouble for a small household, and the trouble would not fall upon him. It never does. He would go back to his own country in the end, as great men do, and be none the worse. But the woman he had lingered near would be left to live in the wreck of it, in a place where everyone had seen, and remembered, and would not let her forget. You must think, your grace, before you are kind to the wrong sister. Kindness is a coin like beauty. Spent carelessly, it ruins the one who receives it. You speak as though you had seen it done. I have seen a good deal done, she said, from the foot of the table. It is a wonderful place from which to watch the world. No one troubles to perform for the woman at the foot of the table. And so one sees them all exactly as they are. She rose then, gathering the ledger to her, and the movement brought her round the end of the table and near to him, and he stood too, because a man stood when a woman rose, and they were of a sudden closer than they had been. A bare foot of candlelit air between them, and neither moved to widen it. He looked at her by that one flame, the grey gown, the ink upon her finger, the plain brown hair coming loose at the temple after a day's honest work, the eyes that met his without calculation and without retreat. And he understood, with the slow terror of a man feeling a familiar ground give way, that he had not looked at a living soul in this manner since he had stood at another woman's grave 6 years gone and resolved, in the cold rain, to spend the rest of his life at a careful distance from everyone. You have ink upon your hand, he said, because he could not say the other thing. I generally have. She did not look at her hand, she looked at him. He reached out. He did not decide to. His hand rose of its own accord, as if it had waited 15 years for the leave he had never given it, and he took her fingers to turn them toward the light, as though the smudge of ink were a matter of the gravest interest to a duke. Her hand was cold and work-roughened and steady in his, and at the touch of it something went through him that no drawing-room in England had ever managed, a warmth so sudden and so total that it frightened him more than any cannon ever had. She did not pull away. He felt her breath change. For the length of 3 heartbeats they stood so, his thumb resting against the ink upon her finger, the harp threading its faultless melody through the walls, the candle burning down, and the whole careful architecture of his life leaning, groaning, beginning to come apart at a single point of contact no wider than a coin. Then she drew her hand back, gently, without offense, but firmly, as a woman draws back from a warmth she has taught herself she may not keep. "There," she said, and her voice was not quite level, which undid him further than the touch had done, for it was the first unrehearsed thing he had heard in that house that was not a cruelty. "Now you have ink on your own hand, your grace, and you will have to explain it to your valet, and I cannot think how you will. Vespera." It was the first time he had used her name, and it stopped her at the door as surely as a hand upon her arm. He had meant to say a great many things. He had meant, God help him, to say some of the true ones of the wife he had chosen sensibly and buried too soon, and the child that had not lived a day with her, and the door he had shut on his own heart at their 2 gravesides and locked and thrown away the key of, so that no one might ever again take from him what could be taken, of how he had come into this county certain that his heart was a room with the furniture under sheets, and had walked out one grey morning to see the roses and found the sheets pulled off and the fire lit, and someone standing at the window who had not asked his leave to be there. He had meant to say all of it. He was a man unused to saying anything. "Do not," she said before he could, and it was not sharp. It was almost tender, and the more terrible for it. "Whatever it is, your grace, do not say it tonight. Say it to yourself first 100 times in the cold, where there is no candle and no music and no pretty face waiting at a harp to make everything seem possible. Say it to yourself until you are quite sure it is not merely that you are lonely and tired of being looked at, and have found for once a woman who does not look at you at all. That is a real thing to feel, and a poor thing to build upon. If in a week you are still sure, you will know where to find me. I shall be among the roses, cutting them back before the frost, exactly as I was, wanting nothing of you." She opened the door upon the cold passage and the nearing music. "That is the only gift I have to give a duke, that I want nothing of him. Do not make me spend it foolishly." And she was gone, the candle shadow swinging up the wall behind her, leaving him alone in the one room nobody scoured, with ink upon his hand and his armour lying somewhere on the floor of a strange library, where he would never find all the pieces of it again. He stood there a long while. When at last he went out, it was by the far door, to avoid the drawing-room, and he came upon Prudence Thackeray in the passage. She was not her harp after all. She had left it, or sent someone else to play it, and she stood at the turning of the corridor in her primrose gown with a branch of candles in a wall sconce burning beside her lovely face, and she had the look of a woman who had been standing there some little while. Her smile was as perfect as ever, only her eyes had changed. They went once to his hand where the ink was, and then up to his face, and in that single unguarded instant he saw beneath the beauty at last, all the way to the bottom, and did not like what stood there. "You have found our library, your grace," she said, sweet as spun sugar. "I hope my sister did not weary you with her accounts. She is forever at her ledgers. It is a homely sort of accomplishment, but then someone must have the homely accomplishments, and it keeps her from feeling the want of the others. The little run of bells that was her laugh. You must not let her make you sad with her tales of horses and farms. She has a way of telling them that quite wrings the heart. I have often thought, if she had been born handsomer, what a great actress she should have made. As it is, she performs only for gentlemen in libraries, and only the one part, and I fear it is a part designed to be pitied. You are far too wise to be taken in by it. I am not, I find, half so wise as I believed when I came into this county," Norbert said. "Good night, Miss Thackeray." He bowed and left her standing in the candlelight, and he did not look back. But he felt her eyes upon him the whole length of the passage, cold now behind their beauty, calculating, and he knew, with the certainty of a man who had spent 15 years watching people measure him, that he had made an enemy that night without meaning to, and that she had understood, before he had let himself fully understand it, precisely where his heart had gone. A woman raised for one purpose does not lightly suffer the prize to be carried off by the sister at the foot of the table. She would not weep, and she would not rage. She would arrange something, the way she arranged the candlelight upon her cheek, with care and patience and a perfect smile, and she would arrange it so that no blame could ever fall upon her. He climbed the cold stair to his borrowed room with the ink drying on his hand, and did not summon the valet, and lay a long time awake in the dark she had prescribed for him, saying the true things over to himself 100 times as she had bidden, and every time he came to the end of them, he was more sure, not less, and every time he was more sure, he understood more plainly that being sure would not be enough. That the roof and the horses and the ledgers and the pretty daughter raised like a hothouse peach were all of them ranged now between himself and the one plain window where the fire had been lit, and that somewhere in the fine polished house, below him a beautiful woman was already in the dark, beginning to think. 3 days had passed since the assembly at Hardwick, and the Duke of Linshore had not gone home. He had reasons, and he gave them to the household with a face that dared anyone to examine them too closely. The roads were bad. He had business with a neighbouring landowner. He wished to see the North Country in its autumn. Sir Harold received each reason with a beaming gratitude that would have shamed a lesser man, and Mrs. Thackeray received them with a smile that had grown, over those 3 days, a fraction more fixed each morning, like ice thickening on a pond. They believed the Duke lingered for Adela. They arranged the days around that belief, contriving walks and card parties and a drive to see a ruined abbey, forever setting the beauty at his elbow in her white muslins, forever steering the conversation toward town and titles and the great cold splendor of Linshore. And forever, without their leave and quite past his power to prevent it, his eyes found the grey gown at the edge of the room. He had spent those 3 days learning the true geography of Merowden, not the front rooms where the family performed, but the back passages and the walled garden and the small cold library where no one but Vespera ever seemed to go, and where he had fallen into the habit of finding her at dusk with the account books open before her, a single candle burning, her wren-brown head bent over columns of figures that told the whole grim truth of the house more plainly than Sir Harold ever would. She did not flatter him there. She did not perform. She talked to him of the frost and the failing rents, and once, haltingly, of a mother dead these 15 years, whose pearls were the only thing of beauty left in the house that the creditors had not yet counted, and she had said it without self-pity, closing the ledger as she spoke, as a woman closes a door on a room she has decided not to grieve in. He had come away from that hour more thoroughly undone than from any other in his life, and had lain awake in the borrowed bed knowing, with the terrible plainness of a man who has stopped lying to himself at last, that he did not mean to marry Adela Westbourne, and that he must find the courage to say so before the week was out, and let the whole ambitious house fall about their ears, rather than take a wife he did not want to spare a woman he did. He had resolved to speak to Sir Harold that very morning. He never had the chance. He came down early, as was his custom, and found the house not hushed but humming, a low agitated hum, doors opening and closing, a servant's quick feet upon the back stair, Mrs. Thackeray's voice pitched somewhere between grief and iron. He followed it to the morning room and found the family already assembled, and knew at a glance that something had broken. Sir Harold stood grey-faced by the window. Adela sat very still with her hands in her lap and her lovely face gone the colour of tallow. 2 of the maids hovered in the doorway, wide-eyed, and in the centre of it all stood Mrs. Thackeray, in her plum morning gown, holding an empty jewel case open in both hands as though displaying a wound. "Your Grace." She turned to him, and her eyes were bright with a distress so perfectly pitched that only a man who had spent 15 years among such performances would have caught the calculation beneath it. "Forgive us. Forgive this. You should not see a family at such a moment. I would have spared you it for the world." She drew a breath that trembled exactly as much as it ought. "My sister's pearls are gone. The Westbourne pearls, they've come down 3 generations, the last thing of any value this poor house possessed. Taken, stolen. From my own cabinet in the night." Norbert looked at the empty case. He looked at the grey faces round the room. And he was aware, before any word was spoken, of a small cold certainty gathering in him, for there was one person the room did not contain, one grey gown missing from its usual place at the margin, and he understood the shape of the thing that was coming a full breath before it arrived. "Where is Miss Vespera?" he said. The silence that met the question was its own answer. "She has been sent for," said Mrs. Thackeray, and something moved at the back of her voice, a note of dreadful, gentle regret that made his skin crawl. "Your Grace, I would give a great deal not to say what I must say before you. But you have been a guest in this house, and you have shown my younger niece a marked kindness, and it is only right you should know the truth of the person on whom you have spent it." She set down the empty case with the care of a woman laying a body out. "Vespera keeps our accounts. Vespera keeps the keys. Vespera alone of all this household knew where the pearls were kept and had the means to reach them, and Vespera, the breath again, the tremble measured to the drop, has these 3 months been in correspondence with a party in the city about the sale of certain goods. I have the letter. I did not seek it. It was left in the ledger, Your Grace, folded among the very accounts she is trusted to keep. She produced it then, a single sheet, and held it out to him across the room, and Norbert did not take it. He stood where he was, and the morning went very quiet around, and he felt the old thing wake. It woke the way it always woke, not as pain at first, but as cold, a familiar arctic clarity spreading out from the center of him. 15 years fell away in a heartbeat. He was young again and standing in another handsome room, holding another proof in another woman's hand, learning for the first time what he had since built his whole life around never having to learn twice, that the gentlest face may be the most practiced, that the softest word may be the best baited hook, that the very artlessness which slips a man's guard is precisely the artlessness a clever creature would counterfeit if she wished to take a fortune from a fool, a woman who wanted nothing, a woman with no design. Was that not exactly what she had told him, again and again, in the garden and the library and the terrace dark? "I have nothing to gain from you. You may believe what little I say." Was that not the one lure in all the world that could have gone past the wall he had kept for 6 years? The appearance of having no lure at all. He was ashamed, afterward, of how long the poison held him. It could not have been more than the space of a dozen heartbeats. But in those heartbeats the Duke of Linshaw stood in the morning room at Meroden and wavered, truly wavered, the whole warm certainty of 3 days curdling in him toward the cold, and Mrs. Thackeray, watching his face with the patience of a woman who has laid her powder and needs only the spark to catch, saw him waver and knew that she had judged him aright, and pressed. "I know how it must strike you," she said, softer still. "A clever girl. A portionless girl, Your Grace, with no prospects and no scruple, who saw a duke ride up to this door and understood at once that the front way was closed to her, and so contrived the back. Who made herself so very honest, so very unlike the rest of us, for she is clever. I have never denied she is clever, that a discerning man might take the plainness for a jewel, and never think to look for the paste beneath. And who meant, I do not doubt, to be gone with the pearls to her friend in the city before the month was out, whether the Duke were caught or no. She let the letter fall to the table between them. "I am only sorry you should have been so nearly taken in. It is what I feared from the first hour I saw your eyes go to her. I said nothing, for who am I to counsel a duke? But a mother, an aunt who has stood as a mother, cannot in conscience let a good man be robbed of his heart and his purse both by a viper she has warmed at her own hearth." It was very well done. He would grant her that later, when he could bear to think of it. It was a masterpiece of its kind, built out of the exact materials of his ruin. Every stone of it fitted to the wound she had somehow read in him, and that, in the end, was what saved him. For he stood there letting the cold have him, and some part of him, the part that had sat in a cold library at dusk, and been given the truth like a gift he had not asked for, said very quietly beneath the roaring, "This is too well made. It is too exactly the thing you fear." No accident ever fitted a man's terror so neatly. Only a hand that knew the terror could have built a snare so perfectly shaped to spring it. And then the door opened, and Vespera came in, and the wavering was over. She had been in the garden. He saw it at once, the way he had first seen her, her sleeves pushed back and a smudge of earth along her wrist and the cold of the morning still on her. She stopped just inside the door and took in the room, the empty case, the grey faces, the letter on the table. Her aunt's arranged grief, the Duke standing rigid in the midst of it, and he watched the understanding arrive in her, watched her read the whole assembled machine of her ruin in the space of 3 seconds, the way she read everything, to the bottom of the page, and she did not cry out. She did not stagger or protest or fling herself upon anyone's mercy. She went, if anything, very still and very straight, the straightness he had marked in the first hour beneath that roof, the back that a light unkindness would not bend, and that a heavy one he saw now would not bend either. "You have found me out, then," she said to her aunt, and her voice was quite level. "How thorough you have been." "Do not," said Mrs. Thackeray, "make it worse with insolence." "I do not think I can make it worse at all," said Vespera. "You have seen to that." She looked at the letter on the table, and something crossed her face, not fear, but a kind of tired recognition, the look of a woman meeting an old enemy she had always known would come for her in the end. "May I see the letter I am said to have written?" "You know very well what it says." "I know I never wrote it," said Vespera, which is a different thing from knowing what it says. But she did not reach for it, and she did not raise her voice, and Norbert understood, watching her, that she had already measured the room and found it closed against her, that a portionless girl accused by the mistress of the house, with the case empty and the letter produced, and the whole family wanting the thing to be true, because the alternative was unthinkable, had no more chance of being believed than a leaf has of arguing with the frost. She knew it. She had known such arithmetic all her life, and she was not going to spend her last dignity beating her hands against a door that had been bolted before she entered. Vespera. Sir Harold spoke for the first time, and his florid face worked with a distress that was, at least, real. "Child, if you will only say where they are, if you will give them back, we need not, the Duke need not. It can be a thing kept within the family." "I cannot give back what I never took, Papa." She said it gently, even kindly, the way she had said everything to him, and it was the gentleness that broke the old man. He turned away to the window and did not answer. And Vespera turned then, at last, to Norbert, and looked at him fully, and he saw that this was the thing she had been bracing for from the moment she came through the door. Not the accusation, not the ruin, but this, the Duke's face, and what she would find written on it. He had not yet spoken. That was the shame he would carry. In all those minutes he had not yet spoken a single word in her defense, and she had seen him not speak, had seen him stand rigid and cold while her aunt built the scaffold, and she read now in his silence exactly what Mrs. Thackeray had laboured to put there. The doubt, the drawn-up wall, the man retreating behind 6 years of stone, and the worst of it, the thing that would wake him in the night for a long while after, was that she did not reproach him for it. She did not plead with him to believe her. She looked at him with those steady grey eyes, and something in her face gave way, quietly all at once, like a bank of earth sliding into a river, and what came into its place was not anger and not even grief, but a terrible gentle understanding, as though of course this was how it ended. She had told him from the first he ought to go. "You need not trouble yourself, your Grace," she said, and her voice was very low, and steadier than any voice had a right to be. "I told you once you should mistake nothing for a debt. I meant it. Whatever they say I am, you owe me no part of it. Go home to Linshaw. You were always going to." A ghost of the rueful smile he had seen on the dance floor touched her mouth and did not survive. "I am sorry only that I made your visit so much less simple than it ought to have been. That was ill done of me. I should have kept to the garden." Vespera, he began, and found, to his lasting fury, that the cold still had his tongue, that 6 years of holding did not let go in an instant, even when a man's whole heart was straining against it. And in the half-second his voice failed him, Mrs. Thackeray struck the final blow. "She will go to my cousin in the north," the aunt said briskly over him into the gap, closing the matter with the efficiency of a woman locking a strong-box. "This morning, before the county has it. There is a household there that will take a girl of no character and ask few questions, and she may make herself useful there as she has here, and we need none of us speak of it again. It is more mercy than she has earned, but she is my sister's child, and I will not see her in the gale." She turned her bright, brimming, victorious eyes upon the Duke, and her voice went soft as ashes. "You see how it is with us, your Grace. A family bears what it must. I am only glad you were spared the worst of it. Adela, my dove, ring for the Duke's chocolate. He has had a wretched morning, and none of it his fault. And that was the whole of it, delivered and done. The pearls stolen, and the thief named, and the ruin arranged, and the beauty's match undisturbed, all before the breakfast things were cleared. Adela rose, white and mute, and went to the bell without once lifting her eyes from the floor. And it was there, in that small unwilling passage of the beautiful sister across the room, that Norbert caught the one loose thread in the whole seamless weave. For as Adela passed her aunt, she flinched, minutely, the way a person flinches from a thing she has been told to look at and cannot. And her hand, reaching for the bell-pull, shook, and once, only once, her eyes came up and went not to the empty jewel case nor to her disgraced sister, but to Mrs. Thackeray's face, and in that look there was neither grief nor triumph, but a sick and swallowed knowledge. The look of a young woman who has been made to hold a candle for a deed she would give a great deal not to have seen done. He filed it away without yet knowing what it was worth, and by the cold hearth the old great-aunt Sophronia, whom the family kept and discounted and spoke freely before as one speaks before the deaf, sat wrapped in the shawl Vespera had settled about her that very morning, and watched the whole proceeding out of pale, unblinking eyes that missed, he suspected, a great deal less than anyone in that house supposed. Sir Harold stared out the window at his mortgaged land. A maid was already climbing the back stair to pack a grey gown into a small trunk, and Vespera Westbourne stood in the middle of the room she had held up with her own 2 hands for years. Condemned on a forgery for a theft she had not done, and did not weep and did not beg, and gathered the last of her composure about her thin shoulders like the made-over shawl she was not permitted to keep, and turned to go and lose everything, quietly, without a hand raised anywhere in that whole bright house to stop her. The emeralds lay upon the white cloth of the dining table, where the lady of the house had set them down, and they held the candlelight the way still water holds it, green and cold and beautiful, and every soul in that long bright room was looking at them, and then looking at the woman in the grey gown who stood accused of having taken them. Norbert had not moved. That was the shame he would carry longest afterward, longer than the fear, longer than the rage that came behind it. That in the first moment, the worst moment, when the letter had been unfolded and read aloud in Prudence Thackeray's sweet-carrying voice, and the whole assembled county had turned as one to stare at Vespera, he had not moved. He had stood at the head of the table like a man of stone, and the old wound had opened in him with a suddenness that stole the breath, and for the length of perhaps a dozen heartbeats he had believed it, not with his reason. With the raw, scarred part of him that had stood 6 years since at a graveside in the rain and sworn never again to be a fool for any living creature, the part that had known, all along, hadn't it, that no one wanted the man and everyone wanted the dukedom, and that the plain, quiet sister with the ink upon her hand had merely played the one part in England. He had not the armour to withstand the part that wanted nothing. So the letter said. So the letter said, in a fair accomplished hand, boasting to some unnamed confederate of how a clever woman might snare a lonely great man by seeming to care nothing for his rank, and mend her father's roof, and be revenged on the sister who had outshone her all her life. It was cunning. It was very cunning. It had been built, plank by plank, to strike him precisely where the timber was already rotten, and Vespera had said nothing. That was what brought him back to himself. He looked down the ruin of the table and saw her standing quite straight beside her chair, her chin level, her hands loose at her sides, and she was not looking at the emeralds or at the letter or at the ring of avid faces feasting upon her disgrace. She was looking at him. And there was no plea in it. There was not even reproach. There was only the same frank steadiness she had turned upon him among the roses and across the single candle in the library. A woman meeting the worst the world could do and asking nothing of anyone to soften it, least of all of the one man in the room who might have saved her with a word. She had told him she would spend everything before she would spend that. She was spending everything now, in front of them all, and she would not ask. Something in the Duke of Linshaw came loose, and it was not his armour this time. It was the sheet that had lain 6 years over the last living room of his heart, and it came off all at once. And under it the fire was not dead after all, only banked, and it caught, for he saw in that instant the whole shape of the trap, and not only the trap upon Vespera. He saw the trap that had been laid with patience and a perfect smile upon himself. He had been meant to feel exactly what he had just felt, that lurch of the old fear, that certainty that he was wanted for his acres and never for himself, that the quiet woman had been the cleverest snare of all. The letter had been written to be read by him and by no one else. Every fair, cunning line of it had been aimed at the one rotten timber in him, so that his own wound would do the work and he would recoil and ride away, and leave the field to the sister who had been raised to hold it. It was a beautiful piece of work. It had very nearly answered, and the understanding of how nearly it had answered, how close he had come in a dozen heartbeats of silence, to letting a dead grief betray the one living thing that had ever thawed it, filled him with a cold, clean fury such as he had not felt in 15 guarded years, and burned the last of the fear clean out of him, and left standing in its place a single plain resolve: he would be a fool for her. He would be a deliberate, open, unashamed fool for her, before this whole sneering county, and count it the wisest thing he had done since he was a young man with an unlocked heart. "Read it again," he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. 15 years of men falling silent when he chose to speak had taught him the exact weight a word required, and he set that weight upon the room now, and the room stilled. The lady of the house, who had been in the very act of ringing for the men to have Vespera's boxes brought down, let her hand fall from the bell. "Your Grace," said Prudence, and her smile was flawless, and her lovely head tilted with just the right measure of sorrowing reluctance. "I would spare you this. It is a wretched business, and no fit thing for a guest to be troubled with. It grieves me more than I can say that it should be my own sister, but you see now, I think, what I could never bring myself to warn you of. She is not what she seemed to you in the library." "Read it again," Norbert said, aloud, slowly, "and then give it into my hand, for I find I am uncommonly interested in this letter." He came down the length of the room as he spoke, unhurried, and the county fell back before him the way water falls back before the prow of a ship. And he held out his hand across the table, and there was nothing in the world Prudence Thackeray could do but lay the folded paper in it. He did not read it. He had heard it once and would not forget a syllable of it while he lived. He turned it instead to the candles, and looked at the hand it was written in, the fair, sloping, accomplished hand with its pretty flourishes at the capitals, and then he looked up, and his eyes found the sideboard, where a great familiar volume had been fetched down as part of the evening's evidence, the household ledger, brought to prove the accounts had been robbed as well as the jewels, for the reckoning was said to be short by £90. "Bring me the ledger," he said. It was set before him. He opened it to the last pages, to the columns filled up in a plain, cramped, labouring hand, the hand of a woman who wrote by one candle to save the second, whose middle finger wore its smudge of ink like a wedding ring, whose letters were honest and close and blotted here and there where the pen had caught. He laid the fine forged letter down upon the open ledger. The two hands side by side in the candlelight, the sweet flourishing accomplishment above and the plain ink-stained truth below, and he let the nearest of the county lean in and look, and then the next. And he watched the understanding travel down from face to face like a draught guttering a row of candles. "This letter," said Norbert, "was written by a lady of accomplishment. Observe the hand, how fair it is, how schooled, how careful of its beauty even in the act of confessing a crime. It is the hand of a woman raised to be looked at, who has been taught since the cradle to make every stroke of her pen as pleasing as her profile." He set his finger to the ledger. "And this is the hand of the woman you have accused. Look at it. Look well. It is a poor plain hand that has never once in its life been concerned with being admired, because it has been too busy keeping this house from falling down about the ears of the very people who despise it. These are not the same hand. They are not the same hand, and there is no man in this room with eyes who can pretend that they are." A murmur went round the table, low and turning, the sound of a mob discovering it has been pointed at the wrong quarry. The lady of the house had gone white to the lips. And Prudence, Norbert kept his eyes upon Prudence. Prudence still smiled, but the smile had begun very slightly at one corner to fail, the way a fine wall fails first at a single joint of the mortar. "Hands may be disguised," she said. "A clever woman, you said yourself she is clever." "I said no such thing tonight," said the Duke. "You said she was clever. Not an hour since. You have been at some pains to tell this company how clever your sister is." He let that sit. But you are right that hands may be feigned, and so I will not hang the matter upon a hand alone. Let us speak of the emeralds. They were found, I am given to understand, this evening in Miss Westburn's chamber. Where precisely? In her workbox, said Prudence. Wrapped in that very letter at the bottom of her workbox, beneath the linens. She stopped. She stopped because the Duke of Linshore had gone very still, and the stillness of him was a terrible thing, and because some animal part of her had felt the ground give a heartbeat before her reason caught up to what her mouth had done. The workbox, said Norbert, softly, into a silence now so complete that the candles could be heard to hiss. The letter was read to us not 10 minutes gone, Miss Thackeray, and it was read as having been found loose, upon the writing slope. Your own mother said so, in this room, before us all. No one has yet said one word of where the emeralds were, nor that they were wrapped in anything, nor that the box had been opened at all. The box, I am told, stands still in Miss Westburn's chamber, corded and unsearched, awaiting the constable your good mother spoke of sending for. He laid the letter down. So I will ask you before this company, and I will have an answer. Who told you the emeralds were in the workbox, wrapped in the letter, beneath the linens? For the box has not been opened, and I do not think, Miss Thackeray, that you can tell me, unless it was you who put them there. There is a particular silence that falls when a room of people who have all together been cruel discover in the same instant that the cruelty was a lie, and that they were made its instruments. It is not a kind silence. It turned now, all of it, away from the woman in grey and toward the woman in primrose, and Prudence Thackeray stood in the centre of it with her beauty on her like a gown that no longer fit. And for the first time in the fortnight the candlelight she had arranged so carefully upon her cheek showed him nothing but a frightened girl who had reached too far. She began, and the sweet voice cracked, and the crack was worse than any confession. I supposed, one would suppose, where else would a woman hide? No, said a voice from the doorway, small and shaking. No, miss, if you please, I can't let it lie, I can't. They turned. A girl stood at the servants' door, a still-room maid, red to the ears and twisting her apron in both hands, a child of 16 who had plainly been standing there a good while gathering the courage that had at last flung her forward past all sense of her place. Norbert had seen her before. He realized, in the kitchen court in the grey light, a scrap of a thing to whom the woman in the grey gown had always had a word and a kindness. Speak, said the Duke gently, for she looked ready to bolt. I were bringing the warming pans up, the girl said, all in a rush, her eyes on Vespera and only Vespera, and I seen Miss Prudence come out of Miss Vespera's chamber this afternoon, while Miss Vespera were down at Widow Coyne's with the broth, that were poorly, and I thought naught of it, only Miss Prudence never goes to that end of the house, never. It's the cold end, and she had her jewel case under her shawl. I seen the corner of it, and she bid me say nothing or I'd be turned off without a character. The child was weeping now, but she got it out every word. Miss Vespera never took nothing in her life. She give me her own dinner when I first come and I were homesick and couldn't eat for crying, and she never told no one, and I won't stand here and let her be called a thief, I won't, and I don't care if I'm turned off for it. It was over. Norbert saw it go over the room like the shadow of a cloud crossing a field, the county turning, the murmurs hardening into something colder, the lady of the house sinking into a chair with a hand at her throat, an aunt somewhere beginning, tremulously, to say that she had always thought dear Prudence a little too fond of getting her own way. He had seen men ruined at a stroke before, in the Lords and in the clubs, and once, long ago, upon a field of honour. He knew the exact moment when the world withdrew its countenance from a soul and left them standing alone. It withdrew now from Prudence Thackeray, and she felt it. And the mask did not so much crack as simply cease. She looked about her at the ring of faces that flattered her all her life and found them turned to stone, and there was nothing behind her beauty to meet the moment with, no strength, no dignity, nothing that had been put there for any purpose but to be admired, and being no longer admired she was of a sudden only frightened and small and quite alone. You have made an enemy of the wrong sister, Norbert said to her very low, so that perhaps only she and one or two others heard it. And you have done it before witnesses, and in a house you were mistress of 10 minutes ago. I will not add to what this night has already done to you. I do not think I need to. He turned from her then, and turned from the whole bright ruined room, because he had ceased entirely to care what became of it. He had eyes only for the place beside the chair where Vespera had stood. She was not there. Somewhere in the tumult of the girl's confession, in the instant the whole room's cruelty had swung away from her and toward its true object. Vespera Westbourne had done the one thing no other woman in England would have done in the hour of her vindication. She had not stayed to be wept over. She had not stayed to watch her tormentor cast down, nor to receive the sudden shamed kindness of the county, nor to hear the Duke of Lincoln declare her innocent before them all. She wanted none of it. She had told him so, plainly, over a single candle. And she had meant it as she meant everything, and while every eye was fixed upon the woman in primrose, she had slipped out through the far door as quietly as she did everything, and taken her cleared name and her unbroken dignity away into the dark with her, wanting, still, nothing of any of them. "Where is she?" said the Duke, and there must have been something in his voice, for the still room maid answered him before any lady could. "The garden, your grace," the child said, wiping her face with her apron. "She'll have gone to the garden. She always goes to the roses when her heart's sore. She'll be cutting them back before the frost." He did not hear the rest. He was already moving, down the length of the table, past the emeralds and the forged letter and the fine-schooled hand bare beside the honest one, past the white face of the lady of the house and the ring of murmuring county and the girl in primrose standing alone in the wreck of everything she had been raised to be. He did not stop for his hat, nor for the servants who sprang to open doors that he flung open himself. 15 years of measured ducal stillness fell from him in the passage like a cloak dropped and left where it lay. He went through the cold house at very nearly a run, a great man with the ink of her ledger not yet dry upon his memory and 6 years of buried grief coming up in him all, at once turned into a single unbearable urgency. A footman gaped. The Duke went by him as though he were a post. He threw open the garden door upon the black October night and the wind and the smell of frost coming, and the candlelit uproar of the house fell away behind him into nothing. He plunged out bareheaded into the dark to find the one plain woman in all the world who had asked him for nothing, who had cleared her name and walked away from her own vindication rather than trade a single grain of her dignity for the county's late repentance. Before she could vanish into the narrow, honest life she had built for herself with her own 2 ink-stained hands, and close it, forever, against him. Somewhere ahead in the blackness were the roses she cut back before the frost, and the woman who tended them, wanting nothing. He had spent 15 years learning to want nothing himself. He knew now, running, that it had only ever been the armor of a man afraid to want and lose, and that he had thrown it off at last too late to keep him safe, God willing, not too late for anything else. Vespera, he called into the wind, and did not care in the least who heard a duke cry out a poor girl's name in the dark. Vespera. The gravel of the Westbourne Drive was still black with the night's rain, and Norbert took it at a pace no duke was ever meant to keep hatless. His coat swinging open, the whole studied indolence of his reputation shed behind him on the steps like a garment he had at last found the courage to be rid of. Ahead of him, small against the grey morning and made smaller by the trunk a stable-boy shouldered at her side. Vespera Westbourne was walking away from the house she had held upright for years with her 2 bare hands, and she did not look back, for she did not yet know that the walls behind her had come down, not upon her, this once, but upon the woman who had raised them. He caught her at the lodge gates. "Miss Westbourne." His voice came out rougher than he meant it, worn thin by the run and by the thing he had left roaring in the drawing-room, the uproar he had not stayed to govern. Old Sophronia risen out of her shawl and her supposed deafness to name aloud what her pale eyes had missed nothing of. Adela white and shaking, the candle she had been made to hold flung down at last, Mrs. Thackeray's violet composure coming apart in strips before the whole staring household. He had not stayed for the end of it. He had heard the truth spoken, the pawnbroker's ticket and the forged hand and the debt to Coving that the pearls had gone to feed. And he had turned on his heel and gone out the long windows and down the steps after the only person in that house who had never once in all his knowing of her raised her voice to defend herself. She stopped. She turned. And Norbert saw that she had been weeping after all, not in the drawing-room, where she had stood condemned and dry-eyed as a stone, but here on the road, alone, where she had thought no one would ever see. The sight of it undid something in him that 6 years had welded shut. "Your Grace should not be out without his hat," she said. "The wind is coming round to the east, even now." Even walked to the gate of her own ruin. She was steadying the dish before it fell. "Send the boy back," he said. "I cannot. He carries everything I own." "Then let him set it down in the road and go back to his breakfast, for you are not leaving." He heard the command in his own mouth and hated it. It was the voice he had used 100 times on stewards and members of Parliament and mothers with marriageable daughters. The ducal voice. The voice that had never once got him a single thing he truly wanted. He stopped. He began again, lower, and it cost him more than the 300 miles had cost him. "Forgive me. I have no right to order your going or your staying. I have used up my rights. I came to this house to be flattered, and I was flattered, and I stood in that room this morning while a wicked woman laid a theft at your feet, and I—" His jaw worked. "For the length of one breath I doubted you. That is the thing I have run out here to say before I lose the nerve of it. When she showed the note in your hand and the ticket and named you thief, there was a moment, one moment, when the old coward in me thought, better to believe it, better to be wrong about her and to have been so nearly a fool as to love where I had no business loving. I have buried people, Miss Westbourne. I learned young that the cheapest way to keep a heart safe is to never let it out of doors. And for one breath this morning I chose the cheap way, and I looked at the truest face I have ever known, and I let myself doubt it. I will carry that breath to my grave. I could not let you walk out that gate without your knowing that I know exactly the size of what I nearly did. The stable boy, Scarlett, was studying the middle distance with the fixed devotion of a servant who has understood that he is present at something not meant for him. The trunk sat between them in the mud. You did not, in the end, believe it, Vespera said. It was not a question, but it was not certain either. No, because a man cannot look at a candle flame and be persuaded it is a shadow. Sophronia spoke and Adela broke, and the whole thing fell out into the light. But I want you to understand, I need you to understand, that I did not need Sophronia. I knew before she opened her mouth. I knew the moment your aunt said the word thief, because it was the one word in the English language that could not be made to fit you, and I would have known it in a court of law with the forged paper waving under my nose. The proof only told the room what my own eyes had told me at that first dinner, when a dish slid toward the cloth and you were the one who caught it, unthanked, and walked out again. I have spent my whole life being looked at, Miss Westbourne. Do you know what a rare and terrible thing it is, then, to meet a woman who never once looked at me at all, who looked instead at whether the old aunt was warm, and whether the fire drew, and whether a duke had eaten, and in the not looking, saw me plainer than anyone alive. Her lips parted. The wind moved a loose strand of dark hair across her cheek, and she did not lift her hand to it. You are speaking to me, she said slowly, as though you had come out to say goodbye handsomely, as a gentleman settling a debt of conscience before he goes back to his own life. If that is what this is, then say it quickly and let me go, for I have a long way to walk and the east wind, as I told you, is coming. No. He took a step toward her over the trunk. No, that is not what this is. Then be plain, your grace, for I have had a lifetime of people being anything but, and I find this morning that have no patience left for it at all. So he was plain. It came out of him not smoothly, not as a speech. He had rehearsed no speech, he who rehearsed everything, but in the broken, headlong way of a man who has stopped defending a position he held for 6 years and simply walked out from behind it into open ground. I love you, he said. I have loved you since the second night, when you would not flatter me about the roads, and I have fought it every hour since with every weapon a proud and frightened man has to hand, and I am done fighting it. Because this morning I watched what it looks like to lose you, and I would rather be ruined outright than be safe like that again. I came here to court your sister. I'm not ashamed to have come. I am ashamed only that it took me so long to see which of the two of you was the fortune. I do not want the beauty that stops a room. I want the woman who holds the room up when no one is watching. I want to be looked away from at my own table for the rest of my life by someone who is seeing to the fire. Marry me, Vespera. Not to mend the scandal is your aunt's now, and it will not touch you. Not to save your father's house, though I mean to see it saved whatever your answer is, and you may quarrel with me about that later. Marry me for no reason on earth, but that I am asking, and I have never in my life asked anyone for anything I wanted so much. For a long moment she said nothing at all, and the fear that came into him then was worse than any he had felt at a graveside, because a grave at least is certain and a woman's silence is not. Say it again, she said at last, the middle part, not the house, and not the scandal. The rest of it. I love you, he said. There is no rest of it. That is the whole of it, and it is more than I have ever had to give anyone. And Vespera Westbourne, who had not wept before the family that condemned her, put a hand over her mouth and wept before the man who had run out into the road hatless to claim her, and when he closed the last step between them and took her other hand in both of his, cold and chapped and roughened with all the work of that house, she let him, and turned it, and pressed her wet cheek against his knuckles for the space of one shaken breath, and that was all, and it was everything. I will not have you, she said, into his hand, out of pity. There is no pity in me for you. There is only envy of every fire you have ever tended and every dish you have ever caught, that they had your care and I did not, and I will not be a duchess. She lifted her head. Her eyes were streaming and steady both at once in the way that was hers alone. I mean it, Norbert. I do not know how to be looked at. I have spent my life at the edges of rooms. If you want the middle of them filled, you have chosen the wrong sister after all, and you had far better take Adela's hand, for she was made for the middle of rooms and I was made for the corners of them. Then we shall stand in the corners together, he said, and let the middle of the room go hang. I have stood in the middle of every room in England for 6 years, and there is nothing in it but people looking. I would rather have the corner and the fire and you. He lifted her chapped hand to his mouth at last and set his lips to it slow, a thing he had wanted to do since a dish of stewed pears had slid toward a close edge a lifetime ago. Say yes, Vespera. You have said everything else. Say the one word left. Yes, she said. And then, because she was who she was, and because the wind was truly coming round, now put on your hat, for pity's sake, before you take a chill, and I am made a widow before I am made a wife. He laughed, a sound that startled them both, for it was not a sound the Duke of Linshore was known to make, and he sent the scarlet stable boy back up the drive with the trunk on his shoulder and the grin of a boy who knew he carried the best news the servants' hall had heard in 20 years. They did not go quietly back into the house. Norbert would not permit it. He had spent 6 years slipping in and out of rooms with his shell drawn close about him, and he found that he was finished with quiet entrances forever. He drew Vespera's hand through his arm and walked her up her own drive and in at her own long windows, and the drawing-room that had condemned her an hour since fell silent at the sight of them the way a guilty room falls silent. It was a ruined tableau by now. Mrs. Prudence Thackeray sat collapsed in a chair with the violet gone grey in her face, the forged note and the pawnbroker's ticket laid out on the table, before her like the instruments of her own undoing, guarded by a manservant Sir Harold had at last found the spine to summon. Sir Harold himself stood at the window a broken, blinking man, understanding by slow degrees that the debts he had hidden and the schemes he had let his wife's sister run in his name had come home all at once, and Adela sat apart, her lovely face swollen and plain with crying, holding old Sophronia's hand as though it were the only solid thing in the room, for it was Adela, in the end, who had been made to hold the candle and could not bear the flame of it, Adela who had faltered and turned and told the truth against her own aunt when the moment came. And if it had come late, it had come, and Norbert would not forget that either. I will be brief, the Duke said, and the ducal voice he had used all his life was in it now, but turned at last to a use worth making. Mr. Coving's paper on this estate is bought and cancelled as of this morning. I gave the order before I came down the stairs, and it is done, and no one in this room owes that man a farthing. Sir Harold, your house is your own again. I do it for one reason, and I will name it, so there is never any mistaking it in the years to come. I do it because I am going to marry your younger daughter, and I will not have the mother of my children begin her life watching the roof come down over the father she nursed. It is not a purchase. She is not for sale and never was, which is a thing this family took a criminal length of time to discover. He felt Vespera's hand tighten on his arm, half in warning and half in something warmer, and he covered it with his own. Mrs. Thackeray. He turned to the grey woman in the chair, and his voice did not rise, for the truly cold thing is always quiet. You called her plain, and you were wrong. She is the handsomest woman I have ever seen, and you simply lacked the eyes for it. You called her thief, and you were the thief. You spent years teaching this whole house never to notice her, and you succeeded so entirely that you forgot to notice her yourself. You never once saw that the girl setting your fires and mending your shawls and catching your falling dishes was the single soul under this roof that a man of any sense would cross the kingdom for. I shall not prosecute you for her sake and not for yours. She has asked it of me already in the road before you had even the wit to be grateful. You will leave this house today. You will live small and quiet somewhere on an allowance the size of your usefulness, and every day of it you will know that the niece you tried to break is a duchess, and that she is the one who spared you. I can think of no heavier sentence, and I would not lighten it by an ounce. Mrs. Thackeray said nothing. There was nothing left in her to say, and Norbert found that he took no pleasure in it, that the humbling of a cruel woman is a cold dish after all, and that the only warmth in the room was the small chapped hand upon his arm. They were married in the autumn, in the plain grey church of the parish and not in any cathedral, because Vespera would have it so, and because Norbert discovered that he wanted whatever she wanted with an appetite that 6 years of wanting nothing had left him wholly unprepared for. Adela stood up with her sister and wept honest tears, and something between the two young women had begun to mend that had perhaps never been whole, for Adela, cut loose from her aunt's ambitions, was proven to be merely a girl after all, vain and frightened and not, in the end, wicked. And Vespera had never known how to keep a grudge any more than she had known how to keep a shawl. Old Sophronia came to live at Linshaw and was installed by the warmest fire in the house, wrapped in a new shawl that was not made over from anything. And she watched the Duke and his Duchess out of her pale unblinking eyes and missed, as ever, a great deal less than anyone supposed, and was well content. And on a winter evening not long after, Norbert came into a small sitting room he had never used in all the years the great house had been his. A corner room, east-facing, that his wife had claimed for her own on the grounds that no one else would ever want it. And he stopped in the doorway, as he had once stopped in the doorway of a hired drawing-room 300 miles, and a whole lifetime ago, unannounced, unseen. Vespera sat in the window with a small pair of scissors, trimming the dead leaves from a pot of rosemary that had followed her from her father's house, and she did not know he was there, and she was not performing for anyone, and the low sun laid itself along her cheek. He did not speak. He only stood and looked his fill at the woman the whole world had been at such pains not to see, and thought that he had spent his life being looked at and had never once, until her, been known. And that a man could stand in a doorway 100 years and never grow tired of watching the one person on earth who had steadied the falling dish of his heart before he even felt it slip. She glanced up then and found him there, and she did not startle, and she did not arrange haste. She only smiled, the plain, unguarded smile she had never once given a room full of people, and held out her hand to him across the small warm distance of the corner they had chosen. "You are very silent, your grace," she said. "On the contrary," he answered, crossing to her, taking the offered hand, folding himself down into the window light beside the only fire he had ever wanted to keep. "I have been given a great deal to consider." And he never let it go again,